the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. Just back from a couple of interesting conventions. The Braver Angels Convention in Kenosha, I think is the right pronunciation, in Wisconsin, situated between Milwaukee and Chicago, symbolically trying to bring together the two Americas. And then last week from the Liberalism for the 21st Century convention put on by Unpopulous, very interesting event. And at both events, my old friend John Rauch was a speaker, a moderator, and I thought it would be a good moment to bring John back onto the show to talk in mid to late July 2024 about the politics of America. John, briefly, what do you make of both the Braver Angels and the Liberalism in the 21st Century event?
What I saw at both, Andrew, by the way, thanks for having me on the show. It is just always a pleasure to talk to you. What I made of both of them was less about the specifics of what speakers said from the rostrum at these two events, but the intense felt desire of people out there in the country for a better type of politics. Yet at Braver Angels, the notion there is you have blues and reds in equal numbers, and they are there to show that they can share the country. And they did show that. And I found that inspiring, but especially because what they're trying to do is really hard, and they're very sincere about it, and they're working in their communities to make things better. And then the liberal conference, it's a bit different. You know, it's more theoretical. By liberals here, we don't mean progressive or left-wing. We mean people who believe in the ideas of the founders about, rotation in government, protecting minorities and free speech and pluralism and all of those things. And what I saw there was kind of the same vibe, which is what can we in this room do to defend our values? Because by God, we are sick of getting walked on.
I think you and I first met, John, when you came on the show to talk about a book which came out in 2021, The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth. It was one of the early books about the digital undermining of truth. One of the people that was on your panel at the Liberalism in the 21st Century event was Renee DiResta. She was on our show last week. Has anything changed much when it comes to our epistemological, ontological crisis over the last 3 to 4 years since you wrote Constitution of Knowledge?
Oh yeah, it's gotten worse. That book came out in mid-2021. And at that stage, it was looking like social media companies were working pretty hard and pretty creatively to do something really hard, which is figure out how to make their environments less informationally toxic. And it looked like the guy who had led the most sweeping and successful political disinformation campaign in US history had been defeated. And was on his way to being indicted. And it looked like we were starting to move on. And that, of course, is not the case. Twitter was purchased by Elon Musk, who, whatever else he is not all that interested in figuring out how to create more constructive conversations online. The other social media companies, to a large extent, trying to do content moderation because they were so attacked from the right for doing that, and because, frankly, it's expensive and difficult to do. And of course, as you and I speak, it looks like the leader of the Stop the Steal campaign is doubling down on all those lies and is quite likely to be the next president of the United States. So I'd say pretty much backsliding.
Let's go back, John, briefly to the liberalism for the 21st century, not in the 21st century. There are a number of speakers there, including Francis Fukuyama. Has been on the show several times. You know him quite well. He gave the keynote end. I actually missed it. You said he presented an image for liberalism in the 21st century. What is his vision, Fukuyama, of liberalism for the 21st century as opposed to the 20th century?
He wants to move beyond what he thinks are what he calls two deformities of liberalism. One of those is what's sometimes called wokeness, the left-wing ideologies that seek equal rights for groups rather than people and divide us into races and oppressor and oppressed and all of that. And the other is neoliberalism, as he calls it, which is kind of excessive free market purism that leaves people too much on their own, distrusts government to ever make things better, just wants to slash it. And his view is that true liberalism is not extreme in either of those ways. It can embrace an active government, and it can do that successfully. And it does not need, in fact, it should reject these far left ideas that seek absolute equality among groups.
John, J.D. Vance now is Donald Trump's running mate. He seems intellectually a reasonably substantial fellow, certainly more substantial than Trump. Does that speak of a post-liberalism now becoming more mainstream? One of the interesting panels at Liberalism for the 21st Century was about post-liberalism, of thinkers like Patrick Deneen. Many liberals just dismiss them, but their ideas are becoming more and more central. Is Vance's appearance on the scene now proof that we are in the age of post-liberalism, or at least where post-liberalism is a credible political discourse?
Andrew, I'm tempted to respond, is that a trick question? Because the answer is yes, clearly, obviously. Certainly, J.D. Vance's intellectual influences. Politico just has a story out today. You might want to link to it, but it's on his 7 major intellectual influences. And Patrick Deneen is right at the top of the list, and so are a bunch of the other modern post-liberal thinkers. And he has become the leading spokesman for the idea that we've got to go instead to populism, nationalism, merging of religion and state. And these folks are, whatever you can say about the value of their ideas, the substance of their ideas, they are formidable intellectuals, and they're feeling their oats right now. They think this is their moment, and they have gone from the far fringes of the debate in the United States to possibly in January the vice presidency and the heir apparency, if that's a word, in the Republican Party. So yeah, this is more than just MAGA now. This is more than just some discontent people with a grievance who want to raise hell. This is now an entrenched ideological movement with a real philosophy and some very smart and sophisticated advocates posing some very hard questions about our future. And I should say, in some ways, that's healthy, right? You want people asking these core questions, but you want them doing that within a commitment to things like the rule of law and telling the truth. And that's what we have not seen so far.
You had an interesting piece, I think it was last month or a couple of weeks ago in The Atlantic. The world is realigning, more on the international relations front. I want to come to that in a second, but are you suggesting then that on the domestic front too, the world is realigning?
Yeah,
we're seeing increasingly the great debate of the 21st century isn't between the communists and the fascists and the liberals of the 20th century, but of the liberals, people like you and I, and the Deneen's and the Orbans and the J.D. Vances of the 21st century?
Yes, if I can do a brief self-advertisement, in August, I'll have a pretty ambitious article coming out in persuasion.community, which is an online website, trying to pull together this picture. It's a paradox, Andrew, because I think Frank Fukuyama was right in what he said way back in 1989, which is if you want to look for a successful system of social management and governance, liberalism, meaning science and liberal democracy and markets, are still the only way to go. They're the only thing that have shown over time that they really work. And not only that, they have delivered spectacularly well. And I'll defend that proposition if you like. Yet at the same time, we see more challenges to liberalism that are stronger and coming from more different directions than I've ever seen in my lifetime. I could count at least 6: communism in China, Islamism in Iran, various forms of Christian nationalism in America, wokeism. That's 4. There's 2 more. So we're seeing a real fragmenting of the liberal consensus right at the time when it is about to bring, our liberal culture is about to bring, in 2030, it's estimated, the 5 billionth human being into the middle class. An astounding accomplishment. And the big question now is, why is a system that has been so successful under so much attack?
Well, you could answer that question, John. You know as well as anyone the answer. What's the reason for that?
Well, I think I'd ask you, Andrew, you're, excuse the expression, a keen observer of these things. But I think there's some failures that are not failures of liberalism per se. I'd name 3 big ones. They're not the only ones. The first is the stresses that are caused by social media fragmentation, the inability to agree on what's true, and the ability to go down rabbit holes, live in different universes. That makes it much harder to run a liberal society. The second is the global phenomenon, not just American, but the global phenomenon of mass migration, which is just putting immense strains on our polities. It's just understandably very hard for people in France or Britain or the United States to look at the sheer volumes of foreigners who are coming in and not think that they're getting left behind, losing their country, seeing their national character change, have their values threatened. And then the third thing that I think is actually the biggest, this will be the subject of my next book, which I'd love to be on the show to talk about in January or February, is the decline of Christianity as a constructive, values-forming, meaning-giving institution. And as Christianity has increasingly secularized and politicized, people turn to politics for meaning in life, for a sense of identity, for a sense of transcendence. And of course, a Democrat can't do that. But what it does do is mean that people bring this kind of intense, overwhelming zeal, this sense of mission to partisanship, and that just makes it very hard to run a country. So those are the first 3 places I'd look.
John, in terms of liberalism, obviously the post-liberals placed religion more and more centrally in their political ideas. I don't know if they are political, maybe theological. Deneen, Vance. Is there a place for religion in liberalism apart from this formal church-state division? Does it necessarily mean that there isn't a religious quality to politics or community or even identity?
There are being able to govern itself, not being as you can. And I've written some dumb things, but the dumbest was it celebrated the rise of secularism in the US. I called it the apatheism, people not caring about religion. I thought religion causes division, controversy. It's inflammatory. We're better off without it. And what I think I missed is that, yeah, it is possible to run an American democracy without some help, some support from the religious team, especially the Christian team, but it's much, much more difficult. And so when you add the three things I mentioned up, it gets really a lot harder. So no, religion isn't technically necessary, but having it not function in a way that is pro-social and pro-democratic, that just makes everything else harder, I think.
John, a few years ago, I had the Economist writer Edmund Fawcett on the show. He has two brilliant books. I'm not sure if you've seen them. One, Liberalism, The Life of an Idea, and one, Conservatism, The Life of Idea. And he said something I thought that was very profound. He said that in the history of the conflict between liberalism and conservatism over the last 200 years since the birth of modernity, it's always the conservatives who have made the first move in terms of reinventing themselves. Clearly, they've done it with this post-liberal shift. Do liberals need to do the same thing in the 21st century? Can they fall back on the assumptions of the 20th century discourse and survive?
Boy, well, that's what we used to call the $64,000 question. And that's what people are beginning to search for in the liberalism conference that we both attended. Yeah, I think we all sense that the Reagan-Thatcher style of liberalism had a lot to say that was good, and that the post-war NATO building, coalition building style of liberalism had a lot to contribute, and so forth and so on. But I think we also all recognize that those things are in the past, and that liberalism now sounds old and tired. And if you're a 21-year-old college student in the United States, you don't want to be lectured on John Stuart Mill and the importance of free speech. And if you're a working class American whose job has disappeared, you don't want to be told about the wondrous qualities of imports to make consumers better off. And so the pitch needs to be rewritten and the ideas need to be updated. And that to me is the big challenge. And it seemed like we saw some of that work starting to get done at the conference you attended. But you tell me, did you start to see any seeds of progress in that direction?
Well, I have to admit, the liberalism for the 21st century, I was a little disappointed by the dismissal of the post-liberals as being wrong or dishonest or disingenuous. You talk about Mill. Is there a father of liberalism that we can return to? Should it be Mill? Might it be Isaiah Berlin? Are there other thinkers, Hannah Arendt? Are there other thinkers that we need to return to understand how to rebuild liberalism for the 21st century? Deneen's done it. I have to admit, I haven't read his book, but I assume he's seeped in Burke and the other conservatives.
Well, he gets them all wrong in my view, but that's another story. So I guess I would resist thinking of it as going backwards for renewal, because the liberal project is about accretion. It takes all of these foundational thinkers and not only the insights they had, but the social innovations they made. Adam Smith and markets, John Locke and toleration, Hannah Arendt understanding totalitarianism, John Stuart Mill, free speech, on and on. You can add them all up, and they're all still there. And there's none I would specifically go back to. I just want to build on them, but I guess there's a partial exception, and that's my personal favorite of them all, the hugely underrated to this day James Madison, who was a political genius and put in place a system that uses our disagreements, that harnesses our disagreements to try to create a stable but dynamic social structure. We call it the Constitution. And it's worked for a long time. There's a wonderful new book out by Yuval Levin. You might have heard about it. It's called, I think, The American Covenant, though I may have gotten the title wrong. And he says, if you want to get this right, you go back to Madison in the sense that you understand that the idea is not to unify our country around a set of ideas. It's to unify our country around the Constitution and the mechanisms that it gave us for working through our ideas. And yeah, I would think that's worth going back to.
It's ironic in a sense. There have been other books on this. We had them on the show. The liberals have become the conservatives, going back to the Constitution. What about the role of America in all this? Of course, Tocqueville came to America in the 19th century. John saw it as a place of democracy. In the 20th century, America was the model for a liberal separation of power between the public and the private. Does America, if America fails to reinvent itself, does that mean that the fate of liberalism is also in crisis? Is America still the motor of the liberal idea? And in this sense, perhaps we can come to your piece in The Atlantic. The world is realigning. An emerging axis of resistance of countries like Iran and Russia and China confronts the liberal alliance, which is still dominated by the United States. So in other words, a new kind of Cold War. It may not be a war, but certainly an international systemic competition.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to think about there. I think the first question that you raised which is if the U.S. begins to flicker as the lamp of liberalism, does liberalism thrive in the world? I think the answer is no. And this might be a moment to introduce the C word, China, which believes it has an alternative model. And that model has turned out to be attractive to one degree or another to a bunch of other countries who say, well, why not manage our markets? Maybe you don't need freedom to have economic growth. So China has become an ideological challenge as well as an economic one. And then we have this other big challenge, which you just mentioned, and that's the axis of resistance. I don't use in my article or generally the Cold War as an analogy, because I think actually the axis of resistance is cleverer than the Soviet Union ever was. You know, the Soviet Union was a big superpower with a lot of nuclear weapons that was meeting America and the West on equal terms and just couldn't do it, and ultimately fell apart. So the axis of resistance is something different. This is a loose network of nations that are led primarily by Russia and Iran, which are now linked together, but also including North Korea, for example, and other countries come and go. So it includes countries, but it also includes militias like Hamas and Hezbollah, or terrorist groups, if you prefer, mercenaries like the Wagner Group, and a lot of private actors. And they formed this loose network, and they're using asymmetrical.
But are you lumping together Hamas and ISIS with China? Isn't that?
No, I'm separating them, actually. I think China is its own thing. It's a direct ideological challenger. It's a peer competitor. I'm saying separate from that, you have this other thing, and that's the axis of resistance. And these are much less powerful countries than China. But what they're doing is banding together in this network with two goals. First, to roll back American and Western influence in their spheres. That's the Middle East for Iran, and it's Europe for Russia. And second, to disprove and push back Western-style liberalism and replace it with authoritarianism in their spheres. And the way they're doing that is by tiring us out. They can just cause so many conflagrations and upsets and attacks. They can attack us with missiles in the Persian Gulf, in the Red Sea, even, these Houthis who are nobodies can stop shipping. They can launch a war against Israel. They can just constantly harass us. And the idea here is that we'll just get tired and we'll throw up our hands, become isolationist and go away. So that's what they're playing for. China is more like the old Soviet Union in the sense it wants to compete in every sphere, economically, militarily, ideologically. It wants to displace us. But these two things do team up, right? China has become the industrial base of the Russian war. So they are supporting each other, and that's the challenge.
John, how does this shift in the Republican Party to a more isolationist, nationalist, perhaps post-liberal Republican Party, a party of J.D. Vance, how does this play into your realignment of the world? Will there be, in the future, a Washington consensus? You talk about the Liberal Alliance. It's a rather thin alliance. If half of America is actually ambivalent, skeptical, maybe even opposed to internationalism.
Boy, you can say that again. Yeah, it worries me sick. So how do you respond to a loosely organized network that spans half the world and is engaged in a constant campaign of harrying? And the answer is the US cannot do that with aircraft carriers. It's just not going to work. What it's going to take is a countervailing network, what members of the Biden administration have called, this sounds a little gimmicky, but I think it's the right idea, a lattice work of cooperation. And that is a whole bunch of countries, including NATO, but also including other allies and on again, off again friends like maybe India, that will cooperate to displace, respond to these attacks, that will fund each other, support each other. A very good example of that is that when Iran fired 300 missiles and drones at Israel, only a handful got through and they were harmless. And the reason for that is that the Liberal Alliance, which included France and England, as well as the United States and of course Israel, but it also included Jordan and Saudi Arabia, astonishingly, were all involved in using intelligence and defensive systems to shoot those down. So it's just essential that to meet this threat, we have an increasingly strong and diverse network of allies around the world. And I am worried sick that where the country is going, where at least the Republican Party is going, and certainly where J.D. Vance is going, is leave us alone. We don't want to hear about it unless they invade us. And if that's exactly the result that the axis of resistance wants, they want us to go into our shell and stop opposing them.
You're worried sick, John. I hope you're getting some sleep. I know you got to end in a couple of minutes, but finally, coming back to America and American reinvention, which is essentially liberal reinvention, since America has always had its foundations in liberalism. You talked about Madison. What areas in particular do you think America needs to focus its reinvention on in the 2020s and 30s? Education, medicine, politics, innovation, AI. Are there particular areas that America can reestablish itself as a world leader and rebuild itself simultaneously? Easy final question, John.
Yeah, easy. Yeah, you're famous for those, Andrew. Well, you mentioned education. That is important. I remember when Sandra Day O'Connor retired from the court and decided to devote herself to civics instruction.
And you grew up with her in Phoenix. You knew it very well. You had a wonderful piece in The Atlantic last year.
Yeah, she was my neighbor, Mrs. O'Connor, the mom next door. But I remember thinking, well, that's a weird thing for her to do. She was absolutely right. Americans now know probably less than they have for 100 years about ideas, that the ideas that frame our democracy. But I think the biggest is actually, this will sound braver angels of me. This goes, I guess, circles back to where we began. But I think there's got to be a civic effort from the grassroots up to do a better job of listening to each other, understanding each other, not demonizing each other, and not getting involved in the politics of animosity so much. And that's hard to do, right? When, social media is the way it is, and when we're getting fundraisers every day telling us if the other side wins, it's the end of civilization, it's the end of America. But it's work that's got to be done. That's why I associate with Braver Angels. Maybe it's why you're there too. And I recognize it sounds maybe a little pie in the sky to talk about civic rebuilding, but we've done it before. Do it again.
And finally, John, very, very briefly, I know you've got to run. Should we be rereading movements of American revivalism, even if they had a religious quality?
I don't know about rereading them, but we should be taking we should be taking inspiration from them. One of the things we should be learning is that we have had earlier periods in American life where people did find sources of spiritual renewal. And that spiritual renewal accomplished some really important things. It was ultimately one of the drivers that helped to end slavery. Can that happen again? I don't think it'll take the form of tent revivals with, Amy Semple McPherson preaching the gospel. But I guess I can hope that it'll be better than Soul Cycle or partisanship. Is that a crazy thing to hope for?
I hope not. Well, I'm going to let you go, John. As always, a pleasure and honor to have you on the show. I have to get you back on. When's your persuasion piece coming out?
It comes out in August.
Okay, we'll get you back on the show because I'm looking forward to reading that.
Yeah, well, maybe you can get Frank and me at the same time. That would be super fun. I could help with that.
Lovely. Okay, John. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Andrew.